She walked into the courtroom with a quiet confidence, unaware that her life was about to change in an instant. The sun was already peeking through the blinds, casting a soft light across the city. It was a normal morning for Vanessa. She had dropped her children off at school, finished her coffee, and now, like every other weekday, she was heading to work at the courthouse. She didn't think anything unusual would happen today. She had no reason to believe that today would be any different. She was just doing her job, going through the motions of what she had done for the last several years. But today something was different. There was an unfamiliar energy in the air, a tension that wasn't there the day before. It wasn't loud or overt, but Vanessa felt it as soon as she walked through the courthouse doors. The usual noise, the chatter, the rustling of papers seemed quieter today, almost like everyone was holding their breath. She passed by the metal detectors and the security guards, the usual hum of their routine, but today it felt off, as if the building itself was bracing for something she couldn't yet see. Vanessa was a court clerk, which meant her job was largely administrative. She dealt with files, checked documents, and ensured everything ran smoothly. Her role was essential, yet invisible. She wasn't a judge or a lawyer, not someone who made the big decisions, but she had seen enough over the years to understand how the system worked, and how it didn't. She had seen injustice unfold too many times to count. The subtle racism, the discrimination that lurked in every corner of the courtroom. It wasn't always as obvious as a slap in the face, but it was there. And after all these years, Vanessa had learned to live with it, to accept it as part of the system. It was hard not to. After all, when you worked in a place where power and privilege ran the show, you didn't question it. You just kept your head down and did your job. But today she couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. She walked through the narrow hallway, past the open doors of the courtrooms, and finally reached her desk. She set her things down and glanced at the clock. Her shift was starting. A few minutes later, the judge entered the courtroom, and Vanessa noticed him immediately. He looked different. His usual neutral expression was now tight, his brow furrowed as if he was anticipating something. He didn't even acknowledge her as he took his seat. It was unusual. Usually, he'd at least give a brief nod, but not today. Today, his face was tense, almost anxious. The first case began, a minor dispute, nothing out of the ordinary. Vanessa had seen these types of cases 100 times, but today everything felt off. There was a new energy in the room, one that was harder to ignore. The air seemed to hum with a quiet tension. Then it happened. A young man dressed in a worn-out jacket and jeans had been called up to the stand. His name was Jamal. He didn't look like he belonged in the courtroom. He wasn't a criminal, not in the sense most people would expect. But he had been caught up in a small altercation, a misunderstanding with an officer. His case was supposed to be simple, a misdemeanor charge that would result in a slap on the wrist. But the way the officers were speaking to him, the way the judge looked at him, Vanessa knew this wasn't going to be a simple case. The officer who had arrested Jamal stepped forward. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore an expression of superiority. He spoke to Jamal in a way that made Vanessa's stomach twist. It was a tone she knew well. A tone that suggested Jamal was guilty simply because of who he was. The officer's voice was condescending, dismissive. He looked at Jamal as if he were beneath him, as if his worth was defined by the color of his skin. It was subtle, but it was there. It was always there. And when Jamal spoke back, his voice shaky but firm, the officer's eyes narrowed. He didn't like being challenged. He didn't like being questioned. His response was quick and sharp, telling Jamal to shut up and sit down. The judge, who had been silent until now, glanced up but did nothing. His eyes flicked between the officer and Jamal, but his gavel never moved. He didn't intervene. The system wasn't built to intervene in situations like this. It was built to maintain control, to silence those who dared to challenge it. Vanessa felt the weight of the moment settle over her. She had seen this before, the tension between a black man and the system, the way the odds were stacked from the very beginning. She had seen the way people like Jamal were treated, the way they were always on edge, always aware of the scrutiny they were under. She had witnessed how the courtroom was never a neutral space, how justice was often biased, depending on the color of your skin. But today, something was different. The injustice in the room felt sharper, more palpable than ever before. And then the moment came. The officer, his patience clearly worn thin, moved toward Jamal. He reached out, shoving him forcefully in the chest. It wasn't a small push. It was an aggressive move designed to intimidate, to remind Jamal of his place. The whole courtroom fell silent. Vanessa's heart raced. She could see the fear in Jamal's eyes, the realization that this wasn't just about a minor charge anymore. This was about something deeper. Something darker. The judge didn't do anything. He didn't stop the officer. He didn't call for a recess. He just watched. He was complicit, but what happened next shocked everyone. Jamal, his hands shaking but his voice steady, stood up. He looked directly at the judge, and then he did something Vanessa never expected. He looked at the officer and said, "If you want me to sit down, you'll have to make me." The room gasped. It wasn't just the words, it was the defiance, the challenge, and before anyone could react, Jamal turned and walked toward the door. He was done. He wasn't going to let them treat him like this anymore. The officer, furious, shouted at him to stop, but Jamal didn't turn back. He didn't flinch. His footsteps echoed in the hallway, loud and steady. For the first time in years, Vanessa felt something shift in the room. The air didn't feel so suffocating anymore. It felt like hope, small, fragile, but still there. But just as Jamal reached the door, something unexpected happened. The judge stood up abruptly, slamming his gavel on the table, calling for order. But it was too late. Jamal had made his choice. He had made a statement. And now the question wasn't whether the system would allow Jamal to walk free. The question was, would it let him live? Would it let him continue to exist in this space, in a place where he was always seen as less? The courthouse was silent as the weight of that question hung in the air. Vanessa felt it, deep in her chest. She had always known that the system was flawed, that it wasn't designed for people like Jamal. But now, seeing him walk away, seeing the defiance in his eyes, it felt like something was breaking, something was shifting. And as Vanessa watched, she realized that she couldn't stay silent anymore. She couldn't pretend that everything was fine. Not when she knew the truth, not when she had seen the way Jamal had been treated, the way the system had failed him. And as she sat there in that courtroom, she knew that this wasn't just about Jamal anymore. This was about all of them, all of the people who had been silenced, ignored, forgotten. Vanessa's heart pounded as the courtroom slowly started to come back to life, the whispers growing louder. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. The tension in the room lingered long after Jamal's exit. Vanessa sat at her desk, her mind racing. She had witnessed countless instances of racial bias in the courtroom, but this was different. It wasn't just the way the officers treated Jamal. It wasn't just the disregard for his humanity. It was something deeper, something more systemic. She felt the weight of it all, the unspoken reality that she had lived with for years but never fully acknowledged. Today it had hit her like a tidal wave, and there was no turning back. The truth was out in the open now, raw and undeniable. But despite the waves of emotion crashing over her, Vanessa knew one thing. This moment wasn't just about Jamal. It wasn't just about one man standing up to the system. This was about the system itself, the judge's silence, the officer's brutality, the way no one in the room had stepped in to stop the injustice. This wasn't a series of isolated incidents. This was the heart of the problem. Vanessa knew that if she didn't do something now, she would be complicit too. She had always been a silent observer, keeping her head down and doing her job. But today, she couldn't stay quiet. The events that had just unfolded in front of her had shattered the comfortable indifference she had been hiding behind. It wasn't enough anymore to just show up, to do her job and ignore the pain. She had seen how broken the system was, and now she could no longer pretend that it didn't affect her. As the day wore on, Vanessa's thoughts kept drifting back to Jamal, to the look in his eyes when he had stood up to the officer, the defiance, the anger, the exhaustion. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who had been shoved aside, ignored, or mistreated by the system. He had taken that first step, and now Vanessa wondered what would happen next. But as the day progressed, the reality set in. The courtroom wasn't the place for change. Not today, anyway. The judge had moved on to the next case, the officers had resumed their positions, and the system had shifted back into its normal rhythm. It was as though Jamal's act of defiance had never even happened. The courtroom had returned to its routine, the machinery of injustice quietly clicking back into place. But outside those walls, things were different. The news outlets had already picked up the story, though they seemed more focused on the drama of it all. They made Jamal out to be the troublemaker, the one who had disrupted the courtroom, the one who had refused to comply with authority. They barely mentioned the officer's aggression or the fact that Jamal had been the victim of blatant racial discrimination. They twisted the narrative to fit the image they wanted to project, the one that protected the status quo. Vanessa felt her stomach turn as she watched the coverage unfold. She could already see the familiar pattern, the same old rhetoric, the same excuses, the same system at work. But then something unexpected happened. It started with a single tweet, a social media post that caught fire almost instantly. It was from a woman named Alicia, a community organizer who had been watching the trial unfold. She had seen the injustice, heard Jamal's voice, and understood exactly what had happened in that courtroom. Her tweet was simple, direct, and unrelenting. This isn't just about Jamal. It's about all of us. Stand up. At first, it was just one tweet, lost among the noise of the internet. But as the hours passed, more people started sharing it. More voices joined in. The hashtag #NumberJustice for Jamal began to trend, and then the protests started. At first, it was small groups gathered outside the courthouse, chanting for justice, calling out the racism they had witnessed. But as the days went on, the crowds grew. The message spread like wildfire. Alicia's tweet had sparked something, a fire that burned through the streets of the city. People were angry. They were tired. They had seen too many injustices, too many lives ruined, too many broken systems. They were done staying silent. The streets were filled with people, black and white, young and old, coming together to demand change. They held signs that read, "No justice, no peace, and end systemic racism." It wasn't just Jamal they were fighting for. It was everyone who had been silenced, ignored, or treated like they didn't matter. Vanessa watched it all unfold on her phone, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never seen anything like this before. The energy, the anger, the hope, it was overwhelming. She saw people coming together, standing in solidarity, calling out the very system that had failed them for so long. But even as she watched, she knew it wasn't enough. The system was still in place. It was still operating the same way it always had. But the protests, they were a start. They were a crack in the facade, and that crack was widening. The next day, Vanessa went to work, but the mood in the courthouse was different. It wasn't the same calm indifference she was used to. Now, there was a palpable sense of unease in the air. The officers who had been in the courtroom the day before seemed on edge, their eyes darting nervously as they walked through the halls. The judge, who had been so stoic during the trial, looked uncomfortable, as though he knew the pressure was mounting. The system was no longer operating in its usual silence. It was being challenged. It was being exposed for what it truly was. Vanessa sat at her desk, trying to focus on her work, but her mind kept wandering back to the protests, to the people demanding justice. She couldn't help but feel a surge of pride, a sense of hope that she hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just a fight for one man, it was a fight for all of them. A fight for everyone who had ever been treated like they didn't matter. And for the first time, it felt like the world was starting to listen. But the question still hung in the air. Would this moment pass? Would the world continue to turn a blind eye? Or would the pressure continue to build until the system had no choice but to change? Vanessa had to know. She couldn't sit back and wait for someone else to act. She had seen enough. She had heard enough. She had been a part of this system for too long to ignore its failures anymore. The truth was inescapable. The truth was undeniable. And then, just as she was beginning to process everything, the phone rang. It was a call from Alicia. "Vanessa," Alicia said, her voice urgent, "we're organizing a rally tomorrow. You need to be there." Vanessa hesitated for a moment. She knew what Alicia was asking of her. She knew the risks. She knew that stepping into this fight meant taking a stand in a way she never had before. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that standing on the sidelines wasn't an option anymore. "I'll be there," Vanessa said, her voice steady. The rally the next day was unlike anything Vanessa had ever seen. The streets were filled with people, fists raised, voices united in a single, powerful chant. Black Lives Matter. The energy was electric, the atmosphere charged with a sense of urgency and hope. Vanessa stood at the edge of the crowd, her heart beating in time with the rhythm of the chants. She had never felt so alive, so connected to something greater than herself. But even as the rally reached its peak, she knew the battle was far from over. This was just the beginning. The system was still standing, still entrenched in its ways. The question was, what would it take to tear it down?